Our study of 2 Corinthians continues today, this being Thursday, October the 27th, and the title of this devotional is, He that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. Our scripture reading, 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, it might be argued that Paul began a defense of his authority as an apostle in chapter 10, and that continues the same through 2 Corinthians chapter 13. Now, you and I might find it strange. The great preacher of the New Testament church era found it necessary to answer his critics. But such was the case for Paul. In fact, that's a contradiction to some who argue that a pastor or a preacher should never answer or rebuke his critics. Well, Paul demonstrates a different approach to that problem. Now, the powerful tone of Paul's first letter to Corinth, and you might remember that it was one in which he had rebuked the church because of its sin. Well, that powerful tone had dealt with sin within the church, and Paul had minced no words in asserting a forthright answer to his critics in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, you might find it distressing, even disturbing, that Paul found that necessary to defend his calling and manner of ministry. And nevertheless, let this be a warning to all. False teachers and phony believers are in the congregation, and such demands a perpetual vigilance of both the shepherd and the sheep. Well, let's turn our attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where we begin with Paul's response to his critics. Now, some in Corinth apparently had derided Paul in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 10, saying that he was weak in person, but he was bold in his letters. Well, Paul answers his critics in verse 3, and sharing with them his desire was to minister to them with the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. And yet some had mistook his humble manner as lacking courage. Well, those critics suggested that his first letter to Corinth was, quote, after the flesh. And Paul declared in verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war in the flesh. Now, what follows, beginning in verses 4 through 6 of 2 Corinthians 10, is a description of spiritual warfare. Now, while the enemies of Paul's ministry appeared as men and women within and without the congregation, the apostle reminded believers the real battle was not physical, but spiritual. In his epistle to Ephesus, Paul wrote in Ephesians 6 and verse 12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. In other words, look past the enemy and see behind that enemy a spiritual enemy. Well, if the adversaries of believers were not flesh and blood, but spiritual enemies and wickedness in high places, how can we, who are believers, go to war and hope for spiritual victory? Well, that answer is 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4 and 5. Paul reminded the Corinthians in verse 4, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, that is fleshly, but they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. He goes on in verse 5, and he writes, casting down imaginations and everything that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Now, consider verse 4. We cannot wage spiritual warfare apart from God's power. Only in the strength of God's Spirit are we able to assail, to pull down spiritual strongholds. What are those spiritual strongholds? Well, some are examples of sinful lusts, sinful passions, thoughts, evil intents. So what is the method then of our spiritual warfare? It is, as you read verses 4 and 5, we must confront and cast down, one, imaginations. What are imaginations? Wicked and evil thoughts. Number 2, we should cast down false doctrine. And that is the phrase, everything that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God. Number 3, we should discipline every thought, bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Now, lest any doubted Paul's courage and intent, as you look at verse 6, he does what you and I might describe today as doubling down. There he declared in verse 6, having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. You see, Paul writes, he is ready to confront false teachers and their doctrine. However, he was delaying his coming to Corinth, giving that congregation an opportunity to choose where and with whom they would stand. Would they choose the truth? Now, notice with me 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 7 through 6, Paul's answer to his critics. Now, there were some enemies who cast dispersion on his physical small stature, and they criticized his preaching for being less than compelling. And you might remember the story in Acts 20 and verse 9 where Paul preached a long message, and a man named Eutychus fell asleep and fell out of a window to his death. Paul, of course, in a miracle, raised him from the dead. And so Paul, now writing and answering his adversaries, he assured them he was capable and willing to address them as bold in person as he had in his first letter. Nevertheless, he had no interest in comparing himself with others. As you look at verse 12, as you look at verse 13, he refused to boast or magnified his accomplishments beyond that which God had blessed him. Well, while false teachers faked their credentials to credit for the accomplishments of others, Paul refused to be a man of that stripe. He determined, verse 16 and 17, that he would preach the gospel where no man had gone. Now notice verse 17 and 18. Paul's overriding desire was to glory not in himself, but his life and ministry would be to the glory of God. Well, I'm going to close with verse 17 and 18. There is no calling, now listen, or office higher than that of serving Jesus Christ. Believer, don't give in to the temptation of falsifying your resume, faking your accomplishments, or pursuing men's applause. May we, as you look at verse 18, serve the Lord faithfully and with a passion that one day you may be commended before Him. Let us not take pleasure in the praise of men. Let us seek to please God. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for today's Heart of a Shepherd. Bye-bye.